Maximilien Robespierre. He was known as the Incorruptible. He was also the architect of the Reign of Terror. He was the face of one of the most important events in Western history, the French Revolution. Okay, so I'm going to preface this by saying that there was a part one where we kind of covered the French Revolution from Louis' standpoint. So there's certain things that I covered in there that I'm not going to go too in depth on in this, and certain things that I left out that I'm going to explain more in this one. So we're dealing with Maximilien Robespierre, who was born May 6, 1758. His father was a lawyer. He actually came from a long line of lawyers. His mother was a homemaker, but when he was about 6 years old, his mother actually died during childbirth, along with the sibling he would have had. Especially at that time, single fathers wasn't really a thing, so he was sent to live with his grandparents. And this transition is important because, according to his siblings, his whole personality changed. He went from a very fun-loving, wild, careless child to a very serious and studious. He was so serious and such a good student that in 1769, he was offered a prestigious scholarship to one of the best schools in France. Where he studied from the age of 11 to 23. 1775, he was picked from around 500 students to give a Latin address to Louis XVI, who we talked about in the previous video, who had just became king that year. But I add this in here because, one, while Maximilian was giving the Latin address, kind of like a school project, presenting it to the king completely was disinterested and looking around until it was over. It was just somewhere that he was obligated to be. Now, I don't know how psychologically that affected Maximilian, but I added in because how their paths crossed. I find it ironic. Now a little bit on what he looked like. Obviously, I'm gonna put in pictures, but they don't completely do him justice. He was 5'3". His skin was milk white, completely pale because he didn't really even go outside much. He was either studying or studying. His eyesight was so poor that the primitive glasses that were used in the 18th century, he had to actually wear 2 pairs of bifocals to actually see. So imagine that you have a 5'3" pale kid with 2 pairs of glasses on, and that's what we're dealing with through school. But being the student he was and reading everything he can get his hands on, he came across enlightenment material. It was basically a new way of thinking, right? Because for centuries we had the monarchy, we had these rigid rules, and now that more people are getting educated and kind of looking at the situation that they found themselves in and saying, well, why does this need to be like this? Why doesn't this need to be like this? And starting to question things. Also, one of the things that was being questioned was religion, and by proxy, because it was said that the kings and their lineage were put in the position of kingship from God. So if we're questioning God, then we kind of got to question the monarchy they were put there by him. So these are certain things that he was reading. In 1782, he actually became a judge at a very young age, and he was known as a very fair judge, but he ended up resigning from the position because he was completely opposed to the death penalty. He was a passive. He also believed in things like ending slavery, not only in the colonies, but across the world. I add this in there because he would become another form of judge later on, but with a very different perspective. Okay, so we're caught up to 1789, which is a lot of stuff I covered earlier. The king is bankrupt because 1, his father funded the 7 Years' War against Britain, which they lost. 2, he's funding the American Revolution to get back at France, even though they don't have the money to do it. So there's a General Assembly called where the third estate, 97% of the population, is going to be asked basically to pay more taxes, even though they're in a financial hardship as it is. And the other 2 estates, the nobles and the church, is to outvote them and get their own way. So Maximilian starts campaigning to be one of the people that represent the third estate in the General Assembly. And obviously, he's wickedly smart, so he knows what he's talking about. But on the other hand, he's a great orator, right? He can give these hour-long speeches, no notes, with passion, and his background in being a lawyer, he was also very persuasive. He was the obvious choice to be a representative for the third estate. And his reputation as a fair just noble person preceded him through his professional career. So again, as I discussed, the two other estates, the church and the nobles, keep outvoting the 97% population, and they become fed up with it, so they break off and they form their own general assembly. They start making votes on things that they want to pass themselves, which leads to the tennis court oath, which leads to the king agreeing to a constitutional monarchy. And at this point, Maximilian actually leaves Versailles, returns home, and basically mission complete. Now at this time, if he would have died or just stayed, went back to his practice, he would have went down as a great political figure in France. But other things happened. So now I want to introduce two more people to the equation. So you have Georges Danton, who was one of the other people chosen to represent the Third Estate along with Maximilian. He was very fiery himself and gave great speeches, so he amassed a following as well. And he started the Committee for Public Safety, right? So you have the Third Estate, which is basically 97% of the population, anybody who's not noble or in the church or royalty. And now they're factioning off into different committees. So it's like you have Republican and you have Democrat, right? So they're all Democrat, but they're different levels. You have far right-wing Democrats, far left-wing Democrats. You have radical Democrats. You have people who are completely off the spectrum. The Committee of Public Safety was just a group within the overall General Assembly or the Third Estate. But Georges Danton and Maximilian had a very good relationship. They disagreed on politics here and there, but their overall goal is the same, and they kind of fed off each other. They say iron sharpens iron, so they would use each other to kind of bolster their own political stances. Now, there were a lot more people than those two, but those two are very important to the story, so that's why I'm keeping it to them two, Max and George. Now, another person who wasn't at the assembly at all, but had a very large effect, was Jean-Paul Marat. Now, this guy was a loser, basically. Before the revolution, obviously times were hard. He was homeless. He was actually living in a sewer for whatever reason. And he contracted a very nasty skin disease. Now, mind you, this is 18th century France, so I can only imagine. But due to this, he had to spend the majority of his time in a medicinal bath, basically soaking to help his condition. So sitting there, obviously he can't sit there on his phone. What he did in contribution of the French Revolution is he had a paper he would write. And this paper was what he perceived was going on in the country. So whether it was true or not, rumors, whatever, he take all the information that he gained and he would write and he would get people fired up. This is what's going on. This is what's going on. Have you heard this? To the point where people started to revolt, riot behind things he was writing. And he just always kept them in a constant state of fear and anger, which was a catalyst in propelling the French Revolution to what it became. So that's why he's important and he's included in the list of people we're going to talk about. Now, Maximilian is back at home doing his thing, but Georges Danton is still there and he's still making speeches and getting people fired up along with Jean-Paul Marat. So this eventually leads to the storming of the Bastille. So once the storming of the Bastille happens, and then eventually the storming of Versailles, where the royal family lives, due to the rhetoric of these people, amongst other people, Maximilian decides to come back and to take part in the revolution. He feels a revolution is needed. But on the other hand, he doesn't want someone who has other political ideologies than himself to be able to direct it. So he comes back and he forms what's called the Jacobins. That's his little section under that General Assembly umbrella. So he's back in power. He has the Jacobins behind him. King and the Queen are arrested in their palace, taken back to the Tuileries Palace. But along with being arrested, it was found that Marie Antoinette was corresponding with Austria about how basically to squash their rebellion. The king's notes had a list of revolutionaries that were actually on his payroll. So they were posing as revolutionaries, but they're really working to undermine the revolution. Sort of a form of COINTELPRO, which is another video we'll get into. The situation Max finds himself in is he's one of probably a half dozen parties, all with different political leanings, but he's ahead of his. He doesn't know who's who. He just found out people are working to undermine the whole revolution with the king. Now, since the king is working with other countries, with monarchs to try and destroy the revolution, now we have other countries as enemies, right? So wars declared on places like Prussia and Austria, along with trying not to get overthrown by other quote unquote revolutionaries that are surrounding you. So you kind of don't know who's who. And the political climate is constantly changing. Now we have our new constitution, but it's often being amended to fit whatever political group is kind of more in power at the time, and they're all constantly jostling for power, right? So it's kind of a time of paranoia. But Maximilian and Danton are two of the top people in power. They have the biggest followings behind them. And this paranoia causes mass arrests to come, right? So basically, all that had to happen was you to be labeled as a counter-revolutionary. If you're labeled as a counter-revolutionary, whether by your neighbors or somebody that didn't like you, or somebody with a little bit of political clout, you're thrown in jail immediately. But you still get a trial, and you can still defend yourself at this point. You still have rights, but that wasn't for long. So we have the king basically captured in the castle, and we have political strife going on. The two major events that lead to the Reign of Terror is the king tries to sneak out and align with Austria to come back and squash the revolution with the Austrian army, but he's found out, arrested, and brought back to the castle. Now he's labeled as a traitor, and they're trying to figure out what the sentence should be, because counter-revolutionary traitors, the sentence is automatically death. But it's the king, so there's kind of a little bit more political turmoil to have to deal with as far as killing the king. So there's one group that thinks he should be stripped of all his power and just a figurehead, have the name king, and that's it. And another group that says we're all men created equal. That's basically what this revolution is based on. So why does he get special treatment? He should be killed like anybody else would be killed. And the Jacobins, who was Maximilian's political party, believed firmly in that second stance that the king should be killed, that it was too dangerous to leave him alive. And they end up winning out. The king is killed by guillotine. And another event that happens is George Danton is accused of being a counter-revolutionary. Now Maximilian has a decision to make here. Should I defend my longtime friend? Or should I put my beliefs in the republic that I've been fighting for years at this point above my own personal friendship? So he stands back and does nothing. George Danton is taken captive, he's arrested, and he's put on trial. Now, while on trial, his arguments are so strong and his oratory is done so well that he starts to kind of sway the jury of his innocence. And in fact, he's so convincing that new rules were passed that during your trial, you couldn't call witnesses and you couldn't defend yourself. So obviously being in that situation, nobody's going to be able to prove their innocence. So he is found guilty, he is sentenced to death, and now you have the king and Danton both executed. And that kind of leaves Maximilian as the number one. Your top rival and the king of your country have both been executed, and along with that, new rules are put in place where it's extremely hard to not be found guilty during the trial, but you're still paranoid about who else is counter-revolutionary, especially if Danton had just been found guilty. Anybody could be guilty at this point. So now the paranoia is ramping even more. This leads to the Reign of Terror. So as I said, Maximilian is the number one politician in the country, but there's always problems around the corner. So during his time, over 300,000 people are being jailed due to being counter-revolutionary or other crimes they perceive to be committed. But unlike initially, where you may or may not be found guilty, at this time, it's about an 80% conviction rate. I think it was only that low because they didn't want to just kill everybody automatically. And this is the beginning of the reign of terror. So now you're having thousands of people killed, all by guillotine, which was referred to as the nation's razor. And now you're having these show trials, which really weren't trials. They were more so mock trials, basically. Now, John Paul Marat was actually murdered by a woman while he was soaking in his bathtub because she felt getting rid of him would kind of stop the mass riots, because he was getting so many people riled up that if you eliminated him, things would probably die down more and things would eventually go back to normal. But once we got rid of him, Maximilian was at his peak sense of paranoia, and rather than having all these revolts and riots, it was more so mass arrest and prosecutions and executions. So you kind of trade one evil for another. So during what's called the Reign of Terror, over 70,000 people were killed. And as I said, 300,000 were jailed during that time. But early on, you could actually be found innocent. But as we go along, it's harder and harder to be found innocent. Another law they changed is to where you can actually sentence 60 people at once. So you have hundreds of people a day dying due to being counter-revolutionary. And at this time, they're fighting a war to keep out Prussia and Austria. So you're fighting a war on the outskirts, and in the center, you're purging anybody you suspect of trying to undermine you. Obviously, this is not a system that can sustain itself. But what I want to compare that to is the Patriot Act. After 9/11, the bill was passed called the Patriot Act. And what it actually includes is, if you're labeled a terrorist in modern day America, you lose all your rights, right? You can be sent to different black sites or even Guantanamo Bay. You don't have the right to a speedy trial, a lawyer, anything that you would as a US citizen if you're labeled a terrorist. Now, I don't think that's been used a lot, luckily for us, but if it was used and abused, this would kind of be the situation you were dealing with. But as I said, Robespierre was all in, right? He slept, ate, and breathed revolution and trying to enact a utopia. But it's obviously a different situation in real life than in philosophy or in your head, right? Almost every idea is good through human history. Communism is good in theory, but name one communist country that's actually prospered, right? So it's people that mess it up, not the actual ideas itself. Now trying to implement these different ideas, people are also going to mess them up. So he's constantly giving these speeches, and he's either giving a speech on what should happen, studying, trying to figure out who's a spy or counter-revolutionary, or trying to figure out what different laws to pass to make his utopia come to fruition. But he kind of burns himself out, and he misses a couple meetings of the National Assembly. And at this point, rumors start to circulate that maybe he's a spy, maybe he's missing this time because he's traveling to Austria and different places to meet with their kings to try to cut a deal, right? And especially supporters who had been, people who have been supporters of Danton. When Danton died, he kind of absorbed the Committee for Public Safety, and he became the leader of that and the Jacobins, so he's doubled his power at that point. But there were some people who felt like that was the ultimate betrayal, so they pulled away. So now he has his kind of secret detractors that were loyal to Danton, but they can't really be outright because he has so much power. And as you can see, people are dying left and right for the slightest thing. So word gets back to him, though, that people are suggesting that he's a counter-revolutionary himself when he's doing everything to try to eradicate the country of it. Also, at this time, they had won a big battle against Austria. So there's a lot of people in the National Assembly saying, well, Austria kind of pulled back, so we kind of got a little bit of breathing room. Maybe we should stop killing so many people in here. I think we're good now. We can start like calming down and figuring things out, which Maximilian absolutely disagreed with. He said the blade of justice should always hover over the neck of the guilty, referring to the guillotine, which was how everybody was dying. So part of his utopia, and what I had talked about earlier with the religion, he envisioned his own religion. So he actually created a cult called the Cult of the Supreme Being. To kind of commemorate it, he has a day where he dresses up nice in his sky blue suit, and he had a pair of platform shoes to be taller. Very important day. And so he goes to the top of the hill. He has a whole parade of people watching him, and he gives an impassioned couple-hour speech. Right? And then he walks by everybody, and goes about his way. And people during his speech, especially his detractors, are saying he's talking about this supreme being and all this virtue, but it kind of sounds like he's talking in third person about himself. Like, who does he think he is? The next day, he comes in to give his normal speech at the National Assembly. But during his speech, he's waving this paper around, and he's saying, and yeah, I heard you've been talking about me, motherfuckers. I got a list look how thick this is. I got a list right here of people, right, that are counter-revolutionary and trying to undermine us. And guess what? Once we get rid of these motherfuckers, then we're going to be in business, right? But he fails to divulge anybody that's on the list. And he storms out. So they're sitting there like, okay, but who is it though? And I'm sure they're very aware that there's been thousands of people that did nothing that died just for being labeled that. So they're obviously saying, am I on that list? You think you're on that list? We probably should do something about this, right? So the next day he comes back and tries to go start his speech, and people run up and they start yelling at him. Who do you think you are? You got me fucked up. I got something for you. I'm about to go pop my carriage. It's pandemonium. He's labeled as an enemy of the state, and he's arrested. He's labeled as an enemy of the state, and the arrest warrants issued for him. But he's not going out like that. So him and his group of closest supporters kind of hold off into a back room. They're kind of having a stalemate with the rest of the assembly. They're armed in there, and they're trying to figure out what to do. But the rest of the assembly is starting to call reinforcements. So once they get to about 400 troops, they send them in to go arrest him, and everybody's right, including his brother and other people. They've been doing this too long. They know the writing on the wall. Once they're arrested, they're going to be executed. His friend shoots himself, and he takes the gun, and he goes to shoot himself. Now, it's not exactly known what happened at this exact moment, whether he just missed or somebody tried to take the gun from him as he was shooting himself, or he was actually shot by somebody else. He ends up hitting himself in the jaw instead of wherever he was aiming. So now he's arrested. There's pretty much nothing he can do. He was obviously found guilty and quickly shipped to the guillotine, where Danton and King Louis XVI and thousands of people he had sent to death were executed. And on his last day of life, where he could have put on a masterful oratory display, right? His last speech before being killed, he wasn't even able to speak. The only sound that he made was when the executioner ripped his bandage off of his jaw. He let out a scream, and he kept screaming until the blade actually fell on him and literally took the head of the country. A man that was so moral early in his career that he was known as the incorruptible, the defender of the people, especially the little people, now became so feared and hated that once he was executed, the crowd screamed and cheered for hours. His death gave personification to the term, you die a hero or you live long enough to become a villain. After his death, things kind of quieted down a little bit. A new council was formed that was a lot less brutal, but still things weren't great in France until a young general would take control of the country by the name of Napoleon. A country that had just killed a king and a tyrant would now have an emperor. What could go wrong?